Hello, my name is Eric, and this is Daily Drivers, where we investigate whether or not various operating systems are seriously usable on a day-to-day basis. Today, we'll be looking into emulation. Of course, emulation isn't an operating system, but rather a method to run OSs. For those who are unfamiliar with emulation, the short version is an emulator is a program that acts like a computer and runs an OS inside it, so to speak. The OS has nothing to do with the OS actually running on your computer. Instead, it is in an emulated computer. Note that I don't say simulated, even though some people use them interchangeably. Simulation and emulation are not the same thing, not quite. For example, I have both a simulator for Palm Pilots and an emulator for Palm Pilots. They work differently, and there are some apps that will work on one but not the other. So you may ask, why would someone want to emulate a computer? I mean, you're already running Windows or whatever. Why would you want to run Windows on top of Windows? Well, what if you want to run an older program that doesn't work on modern Windows? Without emulation, your choices are either install an older version of Windows on your computer, which comes with its own set of troubles, or just don't use the program. Or you can install that older version of Windows in an emulator where it will work acceptably and it won't affect your actual running install of Windows. Another example, what if you're running, let's say, a Mac, and let's say you want to run a Windows-only program. Now, if you're running an Intel Mac, you could always use Boot Camp to install Windows alongside whatever version of Mac OS you have installed. But if you're using a new Apple Silicon Mac, or an older PowerPC Mac, or even an old 68K Macintosh, which is mind-boggling, then that's not really an option. Or you can install Windows in an emulator, therefore not sacrificing this huge chunk of your hard drive. I mean, you have to use hard drive space for the Windows install, whether it's emulated or not, but it's easier to reclaim that space back if it's emulated. Yet another example. What if you need to run multiple OSs at the same time for whatever reason? Say you need to run a DOS app and a Linux app at the same time. You can have two PCs side by side, one running DOS or Windows if the app works there, and another running Linux, or, assuming you have enough RAM and a powerful enough processor, you can run both systems at the same time on the same machine under emulation. And one last example. What if you want to try an OS, but you don't want to replace what you already have installed? In that case, if you don't have a spare computer laying around, then emulation is probably your only option, ignoring things like live CDs and live USBs, of course. Okay, enough examples. Let me tell you a story. Around 20 years ago, I first heard of a product called Virtual PC from a company named Connectix. This was the first time I'd ever heard of PC virtualization, although I first saw an emulator for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in the mid-90s. I got a copy of Virtual PC 4, the first version made for Windows. VPC was created for PowerPC Macs. I installed it and made the installed virtual copy of Windows, which was probably Windows 98, my main machine, so to speak, with it set to automatically revert the emulated machine to a saved copy, discarding any changes. Immediately after Microsoft bought VPC, I decided to try VMware. I tried it under Linux, and I thought that it worked better than VPC, and not just because there was no Linux version of VPC. I'm still using VMware Player to this day. And yes, there are other products, some of them free and open source, notably Box, QEMU, and VirtualBox. I'm not terribly comfortable with most of those other emulators, especially QEMU, which, while it's much more flexible, it's also much more complicated, especially with the initial setup, at least for me. VMware also has the option to make snapshots and revert to them, like I used to do with Virtual PC, but I generally don't use them. For the most part, I'm only using VMs for specific purposes rather than full-time use, but when I was using VMs as my primary system, it worked wonderfully. So, in keeping with the theme of this series, let me just say that in general, using a virtual machine as your main system works just fine for the most part. Hardware and software support varies by both the emulator and the emulated OS, but as long as your chosen emulator supports your chosen OS, things should be just fine. Well, that wraps things up for this episode. Stay tuned for the next episode where I'll be covering Windows. Wow, I'm finally going to be covering an actual OS. If you like this video, please thumb it up. If you don't, well, take it till you make it, I guess. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section and I'll get around to answering them eventually, I swear. I'm always interested in suggestions on what OSs to cover. If you want to see me cover a particular OS, leave your suggestion in the comments section and I'll see what I can do. My name is Eric, and thanks for watching this episode of Daily Drivers.